Sometimes the most broken places hold the greatest miracles. The North Carolina coast lay shattered like discarded driftwood after Hurricane Isabel's fury, trees twisted into unrecognizable sculptures of grief. Dr. Elena Martinez pressed her hand against her swollen belly, feeling her daughter's restless kicks as she gathered storm-broken branches in the fading twilight. 8 months pregnant and separated from her medical relief team, she had no choice but to build shelter before darkness claimed the flooded forest. Her fingers, steady enough to suture wounds in an emergency room, trembled as she wove the branches together. Every movement reminded her of the secret she'd hidden from her husband, her colleagues, even herself. The test results tucked in her medical bag that spelled complications no amount of training could fix. As she secured the final branch, a shadow moved beyond the tree line. A man emerged from the devastation, his weathered face kind, but his presence impossible. In a forest where everything was soaked and broken, his clothes remained perfectly dry. "Hello, Elena," he said, though she'd never seen him before in her life. Who was this stranger who knew her name, and why did his arrival feel less like coincidence and more like destiny? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's medical training kicked in before her fear could take hold. She catalogued details with clinical precision. The stranger's calm demeanor, his impossible dryness in a landscape where everything else dripped with hurricane aftermath, the way he stood as if the muddy ground beneath his feet was solid marble. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" She kept her voice steady, professional, the same tone she used when delivering difficult diagnoses, when maintaining control meant the difference between hope and despair. The man smiled, and something in his expression reminded her of her grandfather's weathered hands holding her during childhood storms. "Not yet. But I know you, Elena Martinez. Daughter of Carmen and Roberto. Medical school at Duke. Emergency physician at Cape Fear Valley for 6 years. He gestured toward her makeshift shelter. And builder of refuges from broken things. A sharp pain lanced through her lower back, the kind that had been coming more frequently since the convoy's Humvee had skidded into the flooding creek 3 hours ago. She pressed her palm against the small of her spine, trying to ease the pressure that seemed to radiate into her pelvis. The baby kicked hard as if sensing her distress. "How do you know those things about me?" "The same way I know you've been having contractions for the past hour. The same way I know you're telling yourself they're just Braxton Hicks, even though your medical training is screaming otherwise." Elena's breath caught. She hadn't realized she'd been timing them, but now that he mentioned it, she could feel the tightening sensation building again across her abdomen. 8 minutes since the last one, 7 minutes before that. That's impossible. I'm not due for another month. But even as she said it, she thought of the test results hidden in her medical bag, the protein levels that had been climbing, the blood pressure readings she'd been monitoring in secret, the complications that could make everything happen too fast, too soon. The stranger moved closer, and she noticed his footsteps made no sound in the debris-littered forest floor. Possibilities change when we're tested beyond our limits. Your body has been through trauma today, the accident, the stress, the fear. Sometimes that's enough to shift the timeline we've planned. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, wrapping around her belly like a vice. She gritted her teeth, counting the seconds until it passed. 45 seconds. Too long for false labor. "I need to get back to my team. They're searching for me." She fumbled for the radio clip to her belt, but static was all that answered her calls. The storm had knocked out most communication towers within a 50-mile radius. "They won't find you tonight. The flash flooding has washed out the access roads and the search helicopters can't fly in this wind." He gestured toward the canopy above, where branches still swayed violently despite the hurricane's passage. "You have time to prepare, but not much." Elena's clinical mind warred with rising panic. If she was truly in premature labor, she needed a hospital, monitors, 4 access, an operating room standing by. not a makeshift shelter in a devastated forest with a stranger who defied every law of physics and probability. "Who are you?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the authority she used in the emergency department when demanding answers that could save lives. Someone who appears when the ordinary world isn't enough anymore, when medical knowledge reaches its limits and other kinds of healing become necessary. He studied her face with eyes that seemed far older than his weathered features suggested. "You've been carrying more than just your daughter these past months, haven't you? Fear, guilt, the weight of knowing something was wrong but hoping you could fix it through willpower alone." The accuracy of his observation hit like a physical blow. She had been carrying those burdens, adding them to her medical bag alongside stethoscope and medications, pretending that her expertise could overcome what the test results had revealed. Preeclampsia, the silent killer that took mothers and babies when the body turned against itself. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of another storm began to fall through the canopy. Elena looked at her shelter, fragile, inadequate, built from broken pieces because that's all the hurricane had left her. Like everything else in her carefully controlled world, it suddenly seemed insufficient for what was coming. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered, one hand cradling her belly as the baby moved restlessly within. The stranger stepped closer to her makeshift hut, and she noticed the rain seemed to part around him like a curtain. "Understanding comes after acceptance. Right now, you need to decide whether you're going to face this alone or let someone help you through what's ahead." Another contraction began to build, and Elena realized with growing certainty that her daughter had decided not to wait for rescue teams or medical facilities. Tonight, in this broken forest with this impossible man, everything was about to change. The question was whether she had enough faith left to trust in miracles she couldn't explain. The contraction peaked and faded, leaving Elena breathless and gripping the rough bark of a fallen oak for support. As the pain receded, her mind automatically shifted into the familiar rhythms of medical assessment, the very routines that had defined her life before this impossible night began. She thought of Cape Fear Valley's emergency department, where she'd worked the morning shift just yesterday. The controlled chaos of trauma bays, the hum of monitors, the weight of stethoscope around her neck as she moved between patients with practiced efficiency. 16-hour shifts that had become 18, then 20 as staff shortages mounted and hurricane season stretched resources thin. Her colleagues had begged her to take maternity leave weeks ago, but Elena had insisted she could work until the very end. Control meant everything when lives hung in the balance. "Tell me about your daughter," the stranger said softly, as if reading the direction of her thoughts. He remained outside her makeshift shelter, respecting some invisible boundary, even as rain began to fall harder through the canopy. Elena's hand moved to her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath her palm. "Isabella. We're naming her Isabella." The admission felt strange in this surreal setting, sharing intimate details with someone who shouldn't exist. "My husband David picked the name. He said it meant devoted to God, that she'd need protection in this broken world." David. The thought of him sent a sharp pang through her chest that had nothing to do with labor pains. He'd be frantic by now, pacing their kitchen in Wilmington, calling the disaster relief coordinator every 10 minutes for updates on her whereabouts. They'd fought before she left for this mission, the same argument that had been building for months. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," he'd said, watching her pack medical supplies at 5 in the morning. "The baby needs you to slow down. I need you to slow down." But Elena couldn't explain the restless urgency that drove her. How sitting still felt like surrender, like admitting the complications she'd been monitoring in secret might actually win. The elevated protein levels that spoke of kidneys under siege, the blood pressure spikes she'd been controlling with medication she hadn't told David about, the knowledge that preeclampsia could steal everything she'd worked to build, her career, her carefully planned future, her life itself. "You're afraid she'll inherit your need to fix everything," the stranger observed, and Elena startled at how accurately he'd read her silence. Someone has to fix things. The words came out defensive, honed by years of justifying her choices to worried family members and increasingly distant friends. In the emergency department, I see what happens when people give up, when they stop fighting. Children without parents, families torn apart by preventable tragedies. Another contraction began building, stronger than before, and she found herself gripping the stranger's words like a lifeline as the pain intensified. 7 minutes. The intervals were shortening with mathematical precision that her medical training couldn't ignore. Through the haze of discomfort, she thought of her morning routine, the one she'd followed religiously for 6 years. Coffee at 4:47 a.m., black with 2 sugars. Review of overnight cases during the drive to work. Rounds beginning promptly at 6, moving through patient rooms with clipboard efficiency. She'd built her life around predictable rhythms, measurable outcomes, the reassuring weight of knowledge that could be applied to heal. But pregnancy had introduced chaos into her controlled world. Morning sickness that arrived at unpredictable hours, fatigue that couldn't be overcome through caffeine and determination. Test results that painted increasingly worrying pictures despite her best efforts to maintain perfect health through diet and exercise and sheer force of will. "I had plans," she whispered as the contraction peaked. "Isabella's nursery is painted soft yellow with clouds on the ceiling. I researched the best pediatrician, the best schools. I've been saving for her college fund since the day I found out I was pregnant." The stranger's expression softened with something that might have been compassion. "And what about plans for yourself?" The question caught her off guard. Elena realized she'd spent months planning for Isabella's future while avoiding thoughts of her own. The preeclampsia diagnosis had forced her to confront possibilities she couldn't control: emergency deliveries, extended NICU stays, outcomes that no amount of planning could prevent. "I don't know how to not be in control," she admitted, the words pulled from some deep place she rarely examined. "Even as a child, I was the one who bandaged scraped knees and talked my little brother through nightmares. Medical school just gave me better tools for the same instinct." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief silence that followed, she could hear her own heartbeat loud and fast in her ears. The baby shifted restlessly, and Elena found herself wondering if Isabella could sense the fear her mother worked so hard to contain, whether daughters really did inherit their mother's need to fight battles that might be better surrendered. The stranger stepped closer, rain still parting around him like he existed in some pocket of calm within the storm. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to let someone else carry the burden. Another contraction began, and Elena realized that all her careful plans, her medical expertise, her determination to control every variable, had brought her to this moment of absolute vulnerability in a broken forest where nothing familiar remained, except the choice of whether to trust in something beyond her understanding. The contraction gripped her with relentless force, and Elena felt something fundamental shift deep within her body. A sensation that had nothing to do with the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. This was different, urgent, final. As the pain crested and slowly receded, she became aware of warmth spreading down her inner thighs. At first, she thought it might be rain that had somehow penetrated her makeshift shelter, but when she looked down, she saw the unmistakable evidence pooling beneath her in the dim light filtering through the canopy. Her water had broken. "No," she whispered, the word escaping before her medical training could impose its usual clinical detachment. "No, this isn't happening. It's too early." But even as denial fought for purchase in her mind, Elena's body betrayed the truth. The fluid was clear, a good sign, she noted automatically, but its presence meant Isabella had decided the timeline for herself. There would be no rescue helicopters, no sterile delivery rooms, no NICU team standing by. Just this broken forest, a stranger who defied explanation, and her daughter who had chosen tonight to enter a world still reeling from nature's fury. The stranger moved closer, and for the first time she noticed he cast no shadow despite the ambient light around them. "Elena, listen to me. Your daughter isn't early. She's arriving exactly when she needs to. You don't understand. Panic clawed at her throat, threatening to shred the professional composure she'd maintained through 6 years of emergency medicine. I have complications, preeclampsia. My blood pressure has been climbing for weeks, and if I deliver without proper medical support— She stopped, unable to voice the possibilities that medical literature had burned into her memory. Seizures, stroke, hemorrhage, death. Another contraction began building, and this time Elena felt an unmistakable pressure low in her pelvis. The kind of pressure that meant Isabella was moving into position, preparing for a journey that would brook no delays. 7 months of careful planning, the birthing center reservation, the detailed birth plan, the contingency protocols, all rendered meaningless by this impossible night. "I need to examine myself," she said, her voice regaining some steadiness as training reasserted itself. "Check dilation, assess positioning. If there are complications—" She trailed off, realizing the futility of medical protocols when she had no equipment, no backup, no way to intervene if something went wrong. The stranger knelt beside her shelter, still maintaining that respectful distance, even as urgency gathered around them like the approaching storm. "What do you need?" The question was so simple, so practical, that it cut through her mounting panic. Elena found herself thinking with sudden clarity, her mind shifting into the emergency protocols that had guided her through countless crises. "Light. I need better light to see what I'm doing." She gestured toward the medical bag she'd been clutching since the convoy accident. "There's a pen light in there and antiseptic. Sterile gloves." The familiar inventory grounded her, each item a small piece of the controlled environment she desperately needed. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. The area around her shelter began to glow with soft, diffused radiance that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Not harsh like the LED penlight would have been, but gentle and warm, illuminating everything within a 10-foot radius while leaving the rest of the forest in natural darkness. Elena stared at the impossible light, then at the stranger who watched her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Who are you really?" "Someone who appears when the ordinary world fails and miracles become necessary." He gestured toward her medical bag. "Your training will guide you through the physical aspects of what's coming, but birth is more than just medical procedure, it's transformation for both mother and child." Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, and Elena felt Isabella moving inexorably downward. The pressure was becoming unbearable, but alongside the physical sensation came something unexpected, a sense of rightness that transcended her fear, as if this broken forest, this impossible night, this stranger who bent reality around himself, were exactly where she and her daughter needed to be. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, as the contraction peaked. Not just deliver a baby in wilderness conditions, but surrender control to forces beyond her understanding. Trust that medical knowledge might not be enough to see them through what was coming. "You know more than you realize. Your hands have guided countless patients through crises. Your voice has been the last comfort many have heard. Tonight, you'll discover that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about helping new life find its way into the world." The truth of his words settled into her bones as another wave of pressure announced Isabella's determination to be born. Elena realized she stood at a crossroads that had been approaching for months, ever since the first troubling test results had forced her to confront her own mortality. She could cling to the illusion of control, fighting against circumstances beyond her influence, or she could step forward into trust, in her training, in this enigmatic guardian, in possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of medical textbooks. Thunder rolled overhead, and Elena made her choice. But as the next contraction began to build, the choice Elena thought she'd made crumbled under the weight of everything she stood to lose. "Wait." The word tore from her throat as panic surged fresh and brutal. She pressed her back against the rough bark of her shelter, as if she could somehow retreat from the inexorable process her body had begun. "I can't do this. Not here. Not like this." The mysterious light continued to glow around them, But instead of comfort, it now felt like a spotlight illuminating her helplessness. Elena's medical training, which had sustained her through countless emergencies, now turned against her with ruthless precision. She knew too much, understood exactly how many things could go wrong in the next few hours, how many ways she and Isabella could be lost to complications she had no power to prevent. "My blood pressure," she gasped, fumbling for the portable monitor in her bag with shaking hands. "I need to check my blood pressure. If I'm having a hypertensive crisis during active labor," the words died as the cuff revealed numbers that made her stomach clench with terror. 180 over 110, dangerously high, climbing toward the threshold where seizures became not just possible but probable. The stranger watched her with those impossibly calm eyes, but Elena could no longer find comfort in his presence. How could she trust someone who claimed to bend reality when reality itself was about to destroy everything she loved? "You said you appear when people face choices between life and death," she whispered, the monitor slipping from her nerveless fingers. "Are you here because I'm going to die? Because Isabella is going to die?" Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment, Elena was transported back to her residency, to a night when she'd stood helpless beside a delivery table as a young mother hemorrhaged faster than the trauma team could replace her blood. The woman had gripped Elena's hand with desperate strength, begging her to save the baby, to make sure her daughter would be okay. Elena had promised, had sworn that everything would be fine, even as life drained from the mother's eyes in the final moments before the emergency cesarean that saved the child, but came too late for the woman who'd carried her. "I've seen what happens when birth goes wrong," Elena said, her voice fracturing. "I've held dying mothers. I've performed CPR on babies who couldn't breathe. I've had to tell fathers that everything they planned and hoped for was gone." Each memory hit like a physical blow. 6 years of emergency medicine revealing its darkest truths. How am I supposed to trust that we'll be different? That loving Isabella enough will somehow overcome pathophysiology? Another contraction seized her, and this time the pressure was accompanied by something that terrified her more than pain, the sensation of her body taking control away from her mind, her cervix dilating according to biological imperatives that cared nothing for her fears. Isabella descending toward a birth canal that might become a trap for them both if Elena's blood pressure continued climbing. "David will be alone," she gasped as the contraction peaked. "He'll have to bury his wife and daughter and somehow go on living. He'll blame himself for not forcing me to quit work earlier, for not recognizing how sick I was getting." The image of her husband standing beside 2 graves was so vivid it stole her breath. He wanted me to slow down, to admit I needed help, but I was so sure I could manage everything through willpower. The stranger moved closer, his presence still radiating that unnatural calm. But Elena found herself recoiling from the very serenity that had initially drawn her. How could he remain peaceful when her world was disintegrating, when every medical instinct screamed that she was about to lose everything that mattered? "You're asking me to have faith," she said, the words edged with bitter understanding. "But faith is what people cling to when knowledge fails. I spent years learning to save lives because I couldn't bear to just pray and hope. I needed to be able to do something, to fight back against death with instruments and medications and protocols." She thought of Isabella's nursery, waiting empty in their Wilmington home, the carefully researched crib and car seat, the baby clothes washed in hypoallergenic detergent and folded with mathematical precision. 6 months of preparation reduced to meaningless artifacts if she couldn't keep her daughter alive through the next few hours. What if I'm not strong enough? The question escaped like a confession, revealing the fears she'd buried beneath layers of professional competence. What if all my training, all my experience isn't enough to save us? What if the only miracle here tonight is watching 2 more people die in a forest that's already seen too much destruction? Another contraction built with relentless force, and Elena felt herself caught between 2 impossible choices: surrender to a process that might destroy them both, or fight against forces that had already proven stronger than her will to control them. The stranger's eyes held hers through the relentless grip of the contraction, and when he spoke, His voice carried a weight that seemed to settle into her bones. "Elena, you're asking the wrong question. It's not whether you're strong enough, it's whether you're ready to discover what strength actually means." "I know what strength means," she gasped, but even as the words left her lips, she felt their hollowness. Strength had always meant control for her, the ability to impose order on chaos, to fix what was broken, to stand between her patients and death with unwavering determination. But here, pinned between hurricane-shattered trees with her daughter pressing urgently toward birth, control had become an illusion as fragile as the branches overhead. The pressure in her pelvis intensified, and Elena realized with crystalline clarity that this moment would not wait for her permission. Isabella was coming whether Elena felt ready or not, whether the circumstances were ideal or catastrophic, whether her mother's medical training had prepared her for delivery in a devastated forest or not. The choice wasn't between proceeding or stopping. The choice was between fighting the inevitable or accepting it. "My blood pressure," she began, reaching again for the monitor that promised the comfort of measurable data. "Will be what it will be," the stranger interrupted gently. "But fear is what drives it higher. Terror is what transforms manageable risk into certain danger. You know this, Elena. You've seen it in your emergency room, patients whose panic made treatable conditions lethal." The truth of his words hit her like cold water. How many times had she watched anxiety escalate minor emergencies into major crises? How often had she been the calm voice that guided patients away from the edge of fear-driven catastrophe? But somehow, when the patient was herself, when everything she loved hung in the balance, that professional detachment had abandoned her completely. Another contraction began building, and this time Elena felt something shift in her perception. Instead of bracing against the sensation, she found herself breathing into it, the way she'd coached countless laboring mothers through similar moments. The pain was the same, but her relationship to it began to change, from enemy to ally, from torture to transformation. "I've been fighting my own body," she whispered, the realization arriving with startling clarity. "Fighting the pregnancy complications, fighting the early labor, fighting the circumstances that brought me here. But birth isn't a battle to be won. It's a surrender to be survived." The mysterious light around them seemed to pulse in rhythm with her words, and Elena felt something fundamental unlock inside her chest. The same instinct that had driven her into medicine, the need to help, to heal, to guide others through their darkest moments, could be turned inward now. She could be both doctor and patient, both the one who needed saving and the one capable of providing it. "Tell me what you see when you look at me," she asked the stranger, her hands moving with newfound purpose to examine her cervix. 7 centimeters dilated. Isabella was making steady progress despite the chaos surrounding them, a tiny body following biological imperatives older than human civilization. "I see a woman who spent her entire life learning to be present for others in their moments of greatest need. Tonight, you get to be present for yourself and your daughter in yours." The words resonated through Elena's exhaustion and fear, awakening something she hadn't felt since medical school, the wonder of witnessing life's most profound mysteries. Here, in this broken forest, with a stranger who defied explanation and circumstances that challenged every assumption about how birth should unfold, she was about to participate in the same miracle she'd helped facilitate hundreds of times for other families. "I can't guarantee the outcome," she said, but for the first time, the admission felt like wisdom rather than failure. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect or that my medical training will be enough to prevent complications. But," the stranger prompted, seeming to sense the shift occurring within her, "but I can promise to show up completely for whatever comes. I can trust that my hands know how to catch a baby, that my voice knows how to provide comfort, that my heart knows how to love fiercely enough to carry us both through this." Thunder rolled overhead, but Elena no longer heard it as a threat. Instead, it sounded like applause from the storm itself, as if nature approved of her decision to stop fighting and start flowing. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than any before, and she felt Isabella responding to her mother's newfound calm by settling into optimal position for birth. Elena looked around at her makeshift shelter, at the supernatural light illuminating her improbable delivery room, at the mysterious guardian who had appeared to witness her transformation. This wasn't the sterile hospital room she'd planned for Isabella's arrival, but it was where they both needed to be. Here, stripped of everything except love and hope and the most ancient knowledge humans possessed, she would discover what it truly meant to bring life into the world. "I'm ready," she whispered, and meant it completely. The readiness Elena felt lasted exactly as long as it took for the next contraction to tear through her with unprecedented force. This wasn't the manageable pressure she'd been experiencing. This was her body announcing that Isabella was crowning, that the theoretical moment of birth had become brutally, immediately real. "Oh God," she gasped, her hard-won calm shattering as she felt her daughter's head pressing against tissues that suddenly seemed impossibly small. "She's coming now, right now." The stranger moved with fluid grace, positioning himself where he could assist without intruding. "What do you need me to do?" Elena's mind raced through delivery protocols, even as her body demanded she push. "Clean water, there should be a collapsible container in my bag, and the antiseptic." Her hands shook as she pulled on sterile gloves, the familiar ritual grounding her even as panic clawed at her throat. "If there's any way to boil water." Before she could finish the sentence, she noticed steam rising from the container the stranger had somehow filled. Not the rolling boil that would take precious minutes to cool, but water at the precise temperature needed for cleaning a newborn. Elena stared at the impossibility, then forced herself to focus on what mattered. Another contraction seized her, and this time the urge to push was undeniable. She felt Isabella's head emerge fully, the sensation both terrifying and miraculous. But instead of the relief she expected, new fears crashed over her. "The cord," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she checked. "It's around her neck." The words hung in the charged air like a death sentence. Elena had seen this complication dozens of times. Knuckle cord, present in nearly a quarter of all births, usually manageable with proper equipment and assistance. But here, alone except for a mysterious stranger, with her own blood pressure climbing toward dangerous levels, it felt like confirmation of every nightmare that had haunted her through the long months of complicated pregnancy. "Can you slip it over her head?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying none of the alarm Elena felt coursing through her veins. "I'm trying." Her fingers worked frantically, but the cord was tight, pulsing with Isabella's rapid heartbeat. Too tight to lift over the baby's head, too tight to allow safe delivery of her shoulders. Elena's medical training provided horrifying clarity about what came next. She needed to clamp and cut the cord immediately before Isabella's oxygen supply was completely compromised. But she had no clamps, no sterile scissors, no way to ensure that the procedure wouldn't cause catastrophic bleeding for either of them. "I can't," she sobbed, the admission torn from the deepest part of her terror. "I don't have the right equipment. If I cut the cord without proper instruments, we could both bleed to death. But if I don't cut it, Isabella will suffocate before I can deliver her shoulders." The impossible choice crystallized before her with surgical precision. Risk everything on an improvised procedure, or watch her daughter die inches away from life. Elena felt the weight of 6 years of emergency medicine pressing against this moment, all the times she'd had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, all the patients she'd saved through desperate innovation, all the families she'd failed despite having every advantage modern medicine could provide. "Look at me, Elena." The stranger's voice cut through her spiraling panic. "In your emergency room, when you face impossible choices, what guides your hands?" "Training," she whispered automatically, then shook her head. "But this is different. In the ER, I have backup, I have equipment, You have the same thing you've always had, the ability to be present with whatever arises and respond from the deepest place of knowing you possess." Another contraction built, and Elena felt Isabella struggling against the cord's constraint. Her daughter's heart rate was dropping. She could sense it without monitors, the way she'd learned to read the subtle signs that preceded crisis in her patients. Time was running out with the ruthless efficiency that medical emergencies demanded. But instead of paralyzing her, the familiar urgency activated something profound in Elena's nervous system. Her hands steadied as training merged with maternal instinct. She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a scalpel, its blade gleaming in the supernatural light that continued to illuminate their forest delivery room. "I need you to hold the cord taut," she told the stranger, her voice regaining the authority that had guided her through countless procedures. "When I cut, there will be blood. Have gauze ready." She positioned the scalpel with the same precision she'd used in hundreds of surgical procedures, but this time the stakes transcended professional success or failure. This was her daughter's life, balanced on the edge of a blade held by hands that hadn't stopped shaking completely. Elena met the stranger's ancient eyes one final time, seeking something she couldn't name. Permission, perhaps, or forgiveness for what might go wrong. "Trust your hands," he said simply. "They know what to do." And in that moment, they did. The blade sliced through the umbilical cord with surgical precision, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, Elena held her breath as blood welled from the severed vessels, but her hands moved with instinctive certainty, applying pressure and gauze exactly where needed, the muscle memory of countless procedures guiding her through the critical seconds that would determine whether her improvised surgery saved or doomed them both. Isabella's shoulders emerged with the next contraction, and suddenly Elena was cradling her daughter's slippery form against her chest, tiny, blue-tinged and terrifyingly still. The baby's lips were dusky, her limbs limp, and the silence that should have been filled with newborn cries stretched like a chasm between hope and devastation. "She's not breathing," Elena whispered, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. Every second of her pediatric rotation came flooding back. The protocols for neonatal resuscitation, the delicate balance between providing enough stimulation to encourage breath and causing injury to fragile new systems. Her fingers found Isabella's pulse point, detecting a heartbeat that was present but sluggish. The cord compression had stolen precious oxygen during those final moments of delivery, and now her daughter existed in the liminal space between life and the possibility of irreversible brain damage. "Clear her airway," the stranger said, his voice carrying the same unshakable calm that had guided Elena through the delivery. But she was already moving, tilting Isabella's head, using the suction bulb from her emergency kit to clear fluid from tiny nostrils and mouth. Nothing. Isabella remained motionless, her skin taking on the waxy pallor Elena had learned to fear in her emergency room training. "Come on, baby," she whispered, beginning gentle chest compressions with 2 fingers positioned over Isabella's sternum. "Breathe for Mama. You're safe now. You just need to take that first breath." The compressions felt simultaneously too vigorous and too gentle, her daughter's ribcage like delicate bird bones beneath Elena's trembling fingers. She'd performed this procedure on full-term babies who'd arrived at the ER in respiratory distress, but never on her own child, never in a forest with improvised equipment and her own body still bleeding from an emergency delivery. "Talk to her," the stranger suggested, and something in his tone made Elena look up. His ancient eyes held not the resignation she feared, but expectation, as if he could see something she couldn't yet perceive. "Isabella," Elena whispered, her voice breaking over the name she and David had chosen during their first ultrasound. "I know this world must seem cold and frightening after the warmth you're used to, but you're stronger than you know. You come from a long line of strong women who fought for what they loved." She continued the gentle resuscitation, while words poured from some deep well of maternal knowledge. "Your grandmother survived the revolution in El Salvador. She crossed borders and learned a new language and raised 4 children in a country that didn't always welcome them. Your great-grandmother delivered babies in mountain villages with no electricity, trusting her hands the same way I'm trusting mine tonight." Isabella's eyelids fluttered. "And your papa?" Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she felt the faintest stirring of life beneath her fingers. He's probably driving himself crazy right now trying to find us. He loves you so much already. He talks to you every night, telling you about all the adventures you're going to have together. A tiny gasp escaped Isabella's lips, so soft Elena almost missed it. Then another, stronger this time, accompanied by the faintest mewling cry that sounded like music crafted by angels. "That's it," Elena sobbed, relief crashing through her with tsunami force. "That's my girl. Keep breathing, sweetheart. Keep fighting." Isabella's skin began shifting from dusky blue to pink, her limbs uncurling as oxygen flooded systems that had been dangerously depleted. Her eyes opened, dark and unfocused but undeniably alive, and Elena felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what was possible. "She's okay," she whispered, the words feeling too small to contain the magnitude of what had just occurred. "She's actually okay." But even as she spoke them, Elena became aware of her own body's distress signals, the dizziness that suggested significant blood loss, the cramping that indicated her uterus wasn't contracting properly to control postpartum bleeding, the lightheadedness that preceded shock. She'd saved Isabella, but the emergency was far from over. "I need to deliver the placenta," she told the stranger, trying to keep fear from her voice. "And I think I'm hemorrhaging. If the bleeding doesn't stop soon." She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood what remained unspoken. The stranger moved closer, his presence radiating the same inexplicable warmth that had illuminated their forest delivery room. "You brought her safely into this world, Elena. Now let me help bring you both safely through what comes next." Thunder crashed overhead, but for the first time since the storm began, Elena heard it not as threat, but as applause. Nature itself celebrating the miracle of new life born from broken branches and impossible hope. The warmth radiating from the stranger's presence couldn't mask the cold reality spreading through Elena's body. Blood loss was accelerating beyond what her medical training considered manageable for postpartum hemorrhage, and the cramping in her uterus told a story she didn't want to acknowledge. Her body was failing to contract properly, failing to compress the vessels that should have sealed themselves after delivering the placenta. Isabella stirred against her chest, tiny fingers curling with newfound strength, but Elena felt her own grip on consciousness beginning to slip. The dizziness wasn't just fatigue anymore, it was the specific lightheadedness that preceded hypovolemic shock, when blood pressure dropped low enough to threaten organ function. "The placenta should have delivered by now," she whispered, her voice weaker than she'd intended. Professional assessment warred with maternal terror as she realized the full scope of their crisis. Retained placenta with active hemorrhage. In a hospital, this would be an emergency surgery situation. The stranger knelt beside her, his ancient eyes reflecting knowledge that transcended medical textbooks. What would you do for another woman facing this same situation? Elena's training provided automatic answers: 4 fluids to maintain blood pressure, medications to stimulate uterine contractions, manual extraction of retained placental fragments if necessary. But here, with improvised supplies and no backup, those protocols felt like cruel reminders of everything she didn't have access to. "I'd save her," she said simply, then felt the weight of what that meant in their current circumstances. To save herself, she would need to perform procedures on her own body that required precision she might not possess, as blood loss clouded her judgment. Another wave of cramping seized her, but instead of the relief of placental delivery, she felt a gush of warm blood that soaked through the towels beneath her. Isabella's newborn cries grew stronger, as if sensing her mother's distress, and the sound pierced Elena's heart with desperate love. "I can't leave her," Elena whispered, the words carrying the full force of every nightmare she'd harbored about maternal mortality. She just took her first breath. "She needs me to be here, to fight for both of us." "Then fight," the stranger said, but his tone held none of the false encouragement Elena had learned to distrust in medical emergencies. Instead, his voice carried the same inexplicable authority that had guided her through Isabella's delivery. But fight with wisdom, not panic. Elena closed her eyes and forced herself to think beyond fear. Manual removal of retained placenta was a procedure she'd assisted with dozens of times in her emergency medicine rotation. Dangerous without proper anesthesia and surgical backup, but possible if performed with careful technique and sufficient courage. "I need you to monitor Isabella while I examine myself," she told the stranger, gently transferring her daughter to his arms. The baby settled immediately against his chest, as if recognizing safety in his supernatural presence. Elena positioned herself as best she could manage, her hands trembling as she performed an internal examination that required her to be simultaneously patient and physician. The cervix was still dilated enough to allow access, and she could feel the torn edge of retained placental tissue that was preventing her uterus from contracting properly. "It's partially detached," she announced, her voice steadying as professional focus overtook personal terror. "I can feel where it's still adhered to the uterine wall. If I can remove it manually, the bleeding should stop." But manual extraction meant deliberately causing more pain and trauma to tissues already pushed beyond their limits. It meant risking perforation of her uterus, risking infection, risking catastrophic hemorrhage if her technique wasn't perfect. The stranger met her eyes over Isabella's sleeping form. "In your emergency room, when you ask patients to trust you with procedures that could save or kill them, what do you tell them?" Elena remembered countless conversations with patients facing impossible choices, surgery that might cure or cripple, treatments that could heal or harm. She'd learned to speak truth wrapped in hope, to acknowledge danger while affirming possibility. "I tell them that sometimes the greatest risk is in doing nothing," she whispered. Her hands moved with the same precision that had guided her through the cord cutting, fingers locating the retained tissue and beginning the delicate process of separating it from the uterine wall. Pain shot through her with each manipulation, but she breathed through it the same way she'd coached countless laboring mothers through their own ordeals. Blood flowed more heavily at first as she disturbed the partial attachments, but Elena felt the shift when the last fragments released. Her uterus responded immediately, contractions becoming stronger and more organized as it worked to compress the bleeding vessels. "It's working," she gasped, feeling the bleeding begin to slow. "The contractions are getting stronger." But even as the immediate crisis began to resolve, Elena felt the cumulative toll of blood loss dragging at her consciousness. She'd stopped the hemorrhage, but her body had already lost too much. The edges of her vision began to darken, and she felt herself swaying despite her seated position. "I need to stay awake," she whispered desperately. "Isabella needs me to—" The stranger's voice cut through her fading awareness with gentle finality. "Isabella needs you to trust that some battles require surrender, not struggle." Elena's world tilted as consciousness slipped away like water through her fingers. The last thing she saw was Isabella's tiny face before darkness claimed her completely and she collapsed backward onto the bed of broken branches that had become their forest sanctuary. When awareness flickered back, it came in fragments, the stranger's voice speaking words she couldn't quite grasp, Isabella's cries growing more urgent, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth that meant her body was shutting down vital systems to preserve what little circulation remained. She'd seen this progression in trauma patients countless times, but experiencing it from inside felt like drowning in medical knowledge that couldn't save her. "Elena." The stranger's voice pulled her partially back to consciousness. "Your blood pressure is dropping too low. Even with the hemorrhage controlled, you've lost too much." She tried to speak, but managed only a whisper. How long was I out? 20 minutes. Long enough for Isabella to become hungry and for your pulse to become dangerously weak. 20 minutes. In the emergency room, that would have been enough time for a full trauma team to stabilize her, to pump her full of 4 fluids and blood products, to reverse the cascade of shock that was stealing her strength. But here, With no equipment beyond her basic medical bag, 20 minutes meant the difference between recovery and irreversible organ damage. Elena forced her eyes open and immediately regretted it. The world spun with nauseating intensity, and she could feel her heart racing as it tried desperately to pump insufficient blood to her brain. When she attempted to sit up to reach for Isabella, her arms wouldn't obey the command. "I can't," she whispered, the admission scraping against every instinct that had driven her through 6 years of emergency medicine. "I can't even lift my arms to hold her." The stranger cradled Isabella closer, and Elena noticed with growing alarm that her daughter's cries were becoming weaker, more intermittent. Hunger and the stress of separation from her mother were taking their toll on the newborn who had already fought so hard just to breathe. "She needs to nurse," Elena said, desperation giving temporary strength to her voice. "Newborns have to feed within the first few hours or their blood sugar drops dangerously low. But I don't have the strength to position her properly." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd successfully delivered Isabella, had saved both their lives through the emergency cord cutting and manual placenta removal, only to find herself too weak to provide the most basic maternal care her daughter needed to survive. "This is what I was afraid of," she whispered, tears mixing with the cold sweat that had broken out across her forehead. "This is why I should never have attempted the relief mission. I knew the pregnancy complications made everything more dangerous, but I thought my medical training would be enough to handle whatever happened." The stranger's ancient eyes held no judgment, only profound sadness. "You saved her life, Elena, and your own. The procedures you performed tonight would have challenged surgeons with full hospital resources." But it wasn't enough. The words came out broken, carrying the weight of every patient she'd ever lost despite her best efforts. "In the end, my training wasn't enough. I can save other people's children, but I can't even feed my own daughter." Isabella's cries grew weaker still, and Elena felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest. She'd brought her daughter safely into the world, only to watch helplessly as hunger and her own physical collapse threatened everything they'd fought to achieve. "I'm going to lose her," she said, the admission tearing from the deepest part of her terror. "After everything, the storm, the delivery, stopping the hemorrhage, I'm going to lose her because I can't do the simplest thing a mother needs to do." The darkness at the edges of her vision was expanding again, and Elena realized with clinical detachment that she was slipping back into shock. Her body temperature was dropping, her pulse becoming thready, and soon she would lose consciousness again. This time, she might not wake up. "David will never forgive me," she whispered, thinking of her husband who was probably searching frantically through the storm-devastated landscape. "I promised him I'd be careful. I promised I'd come home safely with our baby." The stranger shifted Isabella in his arms, and Elena caught a glimpse of her daughter's face. Still beautiful, still perfect, but growing pale with the stress of separation and hunger. All her medical knowledge couldn't change the simple biological fact that newborns needed their mothers, needed warmth and food and comfort that only maternal bodies could provide. "I failed her," Elena said, the words carrying the weight of complete defeat. "I failed them both." As consciousness began its final retreat, Elena heard Isabella's cries growing fainter, and she knew with terrible certainty that her greatest fear was coming true. She was about to lose everything that mattered most, not to the storm or the complications of childbirth, but to her own body's ultimate limitations. All seemed lost. But as the darkness closed in, something extraordinary happened. The stranger's voice changed, becoming layered with harmonies that seemed to echo from the forest itself, and when Elena forced her eyes open one final time, the world had transformed. The makeshift hut no longer felt like a shelter built from storm debris. The broken branches overhead pulsed with soft, golden light, as if sap had been replaced by starfire. The stranger himself seemed to shimmer, his homeless appearance wavering like heat mirages, revealing glimpses of something far more ancient and luminous beneath. "Elena Martinez," he said, and his voice carried the weight of infinite patience. "Daughter of Carmen, granddaughter of Esperanza. You have been calling for help your entire life, but never for yourself." The words pierced through her fading consciousness, like a diagnosis that finally explained mysterious symptoms. Elena saw herself as if from a great height. The medical school student who stayed up all night helping struggling classmates, the resident who took on extra shifts so colleagues could see their families, the attending who never refused a consultation even when exhausted. Always saving others, never acknowledging her own need for rescue. "I don't understand," she whispered, though part of her was beginning to. "Every patient you've saved, every life you've preserved against impossible odds. Do you think your skill alone made those miracles possible?" The stranger's form continued shifting, becoming translucent, and Elena could see through him to where the forest itself seemed to be breathing with supernatural rhythm. "You've been working with forces beyond medical knowledge your entire career. You simply called it intuition." Elena's mind reeled as memories cascaded with new meaning. The car accident victim, whose heart had stopped for 12 minutes but revived with no brain damage after Elena refused to call the code. The elderly woman whose massive stroke should have left her permanently paralyzed, but who walked out of the hospital after Elena spent 3 sleepless days adjusting treatments that textbooks said wouldn't work. The premature twins everyone said couldn't survive, who thrived under Elena's care through interventions that defied medical logic. "The helicopter crash last spring," she breathed, remembering the trauma that had shaken her faith in her abilities. "The pregnant woman I couldn't save. That's when everything changed." "Maria Santos," the stranger said, and Elena gasped. She'd never told anyone the patient's name. "She died because her time had come, not because you failed. But you stopped trusting the partnership between your skill and grace that had carried you through every previous miracle." The revelation hit Elena like lightning, illuminating a landscape she'd been stumbling through in darkness. Her pregnancy complications hadn't started randomly. They'd begun immediately after Maria's death, when Elena had closed herself off from anything beyond pure medical science, rejecting the mysterious guidance that had once made her hands steady and her instincts unerring. "I thought faith was weakness," she whispered. "I thought depending on anything beyond my training meant I wasn't good enough. And so you brought yourself and Isabella to the edge of death, determined to save her through will and knowledge alone." The stranger knelt beside them, and now Elena could see him clearly, not homeless at all, but ageless, his form shifting between human and something that belonged to wind and starlight and the spaces between heartbeats. "You're not really here," she said with sudden understanding. "Are you?" "I am always here," he replied. "The question is whether you're finally willing to see me." Elena felt a shift deeper than physical healing. The blood loss and shock remained real, her body still balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. But something had changed in the space where fear had lived, replaced by recognition of the force that had guided her hands through Isabella's delivery, that had given her strength for procedures she shouldn't have been able to perform alone. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Nothing," the stranger said, and smiled. "Surrender doesn't require action, it requires trust." As he spoke, Elena felt warmth returning to her extremities. Not the false heat of fever, but the deep warmth of circulation restored. Her heart rate steadied, blood pressure stabilizing through mechanisms that transcended medical explanation. The stranger placed Isabella on Elena's chest, and suddenly her arms had strength to hold her daughter close. Isabella latched immediately, as if she too had been waiting for her mother to remember that some forms of nourishment flowed from sources deeper than individual capability. Elena felt her milk let down, her body responding to maternal need through pathways that had been blocked by her desperate attempt to control everything through force of will alone. "She's going to be okay," Elena whispered, wonder replacing terror. "You both are," the stranger confirmed. "You always were. You just needed to remember that healing happens through partnership, not isolation." As Isabella nursed peacefully, Elena understood that this moment, this impossible rescue, was both entirely supernatural and completely natural. The same force that grew babies from single cells, that taught hearts to beat and lungs to breathe, that guided her hands through countless medical emergencies. The revelation settled into her bones. She had never been saving anyone alone. The stranger's form continued to shimmer in the golden light as Elena held Isabella close, feeling strength flow back into her body through channels she was only beginning to understand. Each breath came easier now, her pulse strong and steady against her daughter's warm weight. The miracle of restoration felt as natural as sunrise, as inevitable as the tide. "This partnership you speak of," Elena said, adjusting Isabella's position as nursing instincts awakened with startling clarity. "How long have I been refusing it?" "Since medical school," the stranger replied, his voice carrying gentle amusement. "Do you remember your first successful intubation, the patient whose airway had swollen completely shut from anaphylaxis?" Elena nodded, remembering the terror of that moment, her attending physician watching grimly as precious seconds ticked away, the patient's oxygen levels plummeting toward brain damage. Her hands had moved without conscious thought, finding the narrow opening that shouldn't have existed. "I thought it was just luck," she whispered. "And when luck happened again and again, you called it skill. When skill couldn't explain the impossible saves, you called it coincidence." The stranger's eyes held infinite patience. "You've been so afraid of claiming power you didn't earn that you never recognized the power that was freely given." Isabella's suckling grew stronger, more confident, and Elena felt her own energy returning with each passing minute. Not just the restoration of blood volume and circulation, but something deeper, a settling into her body that felt like coming home after years of exile. "The relief mission," Elena said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "I wasn't really going to help hurricane victims, was I? I was running toward this moment." "Your conscious mind wanted to serve others in crisis," the stranger confirmed. "But your soul knew Isabella needed to be born in a place where the veil between worlds grows thin, where you could remember what you've spent 6 years forgetting." Elena looked around the transformed shelter, seeing how the broken branches now pulsed with soft luminescence, how the storm-tossed forest had become a cathedral of wounded trees reaching toward healing light. This wasn't just a place of survival, it was a place of revelation. "David," she breathed, thinking of her husband with sudden clarity. "He's going to be frantic. The storm, the missing convoy." "Time moves differently here," the stranger said. "He will find you when you're ready to be found, when you can return to the world carrying this knowledge instead of doubting it." Elena shifted Isabella to her other breast, marveling at how naturally her body knew what to do now that fear had stepped aside. The baby's tiny fist uncurled against Elena's skin, fingers spreading like a starfish claiming its place in the vast ocean of existence. "All those patients I couldn't save," Elena said, old grief surfacing but without its familiar sting of self-blame. "Were their deaths my failure or simply their time?" "Both and neither," the stranger replied. "Death is not the opposite of healing, Elena. Sometimes the greatest mercy is letting go. Your role was never to prevent all death. It was to stand witness to each soul's journey and offer your hands as instruments of whatever grace was needed." The words settled into places that had ached for months, bringing relief Elena hadn't known she craved. She thought of Maria Santos, the pregnant woman whose death had shattered Elena's faith in her abilities. For the first time, she could hold that memory without the crushing weight of responsibility that had been slowly destroying her. "I've been practicing medicine from fear instead of love," she realized, trying to control outcomes instead of serving the process. "Fear makes skilled technicians," the stranger agreed. "Love makes healers." Isabella's nursing slowed to the drowsy rhythm of a satisfied newborn, and Elena found herself able to truly see her daughter for the first time, not as a patient whose vitals needed monitoring, but as a complete being whose arrival had transformed everything. "She's perfect," Elena whispered, tears flowing freely now. She's yours, the stranger said simply, born not just from your body, but from your willingness to finally ask for help. Elena looked up to meet his ancient gaze, feeling a plan crystallize with the same inexplicable certainty that had guided her through Isabella's delivery. When I return to the hospital, everything will be different. I won't be practicing alone anymore. No, the stranger confirmed. You'll be practicing in partnership, your medical knowledge wedded to wisdom that flows from sources deeper than textbooks. The golden light began to soften, and Elena sensed their time in this liminal space was drawing to a close. But instead of fear, she felt profound readiness. She had gathered more than physical strength in these sacred moments. She had reclaimed the part of herself that made healing possible. "Thank you," she said, knowing the words were inadequate for the gift she'd received. The stranger's smile held all the tenderness of every guardian who had ever watched over those they were called to protect. "Thank you for finally letting me help." As dawn approached through the storm-cleared sky, Elena felt herself and Isabella preparing to return to a world that would never look quite the same again. The first sounds Elena heard as the golden light faded were devastatingly ordinary. The distant rumble of diesel engines, the metallic crackle of radio static, David's voice shouting her name across the storm-ravaged forest. Reality crashed back with the weight of a collapsing wave, and she clutched Isabella tighter, suddenly terrified that the profound transformation she'd experienced would dissolve like morning mist. "I'm here," she called out, her voice stronger than it had any right to be. "We're both here." The stranger's form had already begun to fade with the retreating supernatural light, but his final words carried absolute certainty. "Remember your promise, Elena. Everything will be different." Within minutes, the makeshift shelter erupted into controlled chaos. David crashed through the broken branches first, his face a map of terror and exhaustion, followed immediately by paramedics whose practiced hands began assessing vital signs, even as Elena tried to explain what had happened. But how could she tell them about the Guardian, about the partnership she'd discovered, about the golden light that had restored not just her strength, but her understanding of what healing truly meant? "The baby," David began, his voice breaking as he saw Isabella for the first time. "She's perfect," Elena said firmly, noting how the paramedics exchanged glances at her remarkably stable condition. By all medical logic, a woman who'd hemorrhaged after an unassisted delivery should have been unconscious, possibly dying. Instead, Elena felt more alert and centered than she had in months. "Ma'am, we need to transport you immediately," the lead paramedic said, but Elena heard something beyond professional concern in his voice, confusion at findings that didn't match the emergency they'd expected to encounter. As they carefully moved her to the stretcher, Elena caught sight of the shelter one last time. In the ordinary light of dawn, it looked exactly like what it was. Branches and debris hastily arranged for survival. No golden luminescence, no cathedral of wounded trees reaching toward healing light. Only the physical evidence remained of the night that had changed everything. But she could feel the change inside her like a new organ, pulsing with quiet certainty. The helicopter ride to Cape Fear Valley Medical Center passed in a blur of medical assessments that revealed the impossible. Her blood pressure was stable, hemoglobin levels higher than they should have been after significant blood loss, and Isabella's newborn reflexes were textbook perfect. Elena submitted to the tests and examinations, while part of her mind wrestled with a growing realization that would reshape everything ahead. She had work to finish. The stranger had shown her what was possible when medical knowledge partnered with forces beyond textbooks, but the revelation meant nothing if she couldn't integrate it into her practice. The real test wasn't surviving Isabella's birth, it was returning to the emergency department and practicing medicine from love instead of fear. Dr. Patricia Chen, her colleague and closest friend at the hospital, arrived as Elena was being settled into the maternity ward. Patricia's relief was palpable, but Elena caught the sharp clinical assessment in her eyes as she reviewed the charts. "These numbers don't make sense," Patricia said quietly, pulling up a chair beside Elena's bed. The paramedics reported a delivery with complications, significant blood loss, maternal exhaustion. But your labs... I know, Elena said, meeting her friend's gaze steadily. Patricia, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. Over the next hour, Elena found herself describing the night's events, carefully, selectively, but with growing conviction. She spoke of the stranger's wisdom about partnership in healing, about the difference between practicing from fear versus love, about recognizing forces that medical training acknowledged only in whispered discussions, about inexplicable recoveries. Patricia listened with the patience of someone who'd worked enough medical miracles to know that textbooks didn't contain all the answers. When Elena finished, her friend was quiet for a long moment. The Henderson case last spring, Patricia finally said. The cardiac arrest that lasted 23 minutes. You refused to call it, kept working when everyone else had given up. When he came back, you said you just felt he wasn't finished. Exactly, Elena said, feeling excitement build. How many times have we both had cases where the medicine worked beyond what it should have, where our hands seemed to know things our training hadn't taught us? Patricia nodded slowly. The pregnant teenager with preeclampsia, Sarah Williams. I changed her entire treatment protocol at 3 in the morning based on nothing but intuition, saved her life and the baby's, but I could never explain why I made those choices. Elena shifted Isabella in her arms, feeling her daughter's steady heartbeat against her chest like a drumbeat of possibility. What if we stopped pretending those moments were accidents? What if we acknowledged that healing happens through partnership, our knowledge working with something larger? You're talking about changing how we practice medicine, Patricia said, but her voice carried fascination rather than skepticism. I'm talking about finishing what we started when we took our oath to first do no harm, Elena replied. We've been practicing half of medicine, the technical half. It's time to reclaim the other half. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Elena felt the final confrontation crystallizing, not with the storm or the stranger, but with a medical establishment that had trained her to trust only what could be measured and explained. She was about to challenge everything. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying Elena's face with the intensity she usually reserved for critical diagnoses. You realize what you're proposing is career suicide. The medical board, the department heads, our malpractice insurance, they're not exactly open to discussions about supernatural partnerships in healthcare. Then, we don't call it supernatural, Elena said, her voice gaining strength with each word. We call it integrative medicine, holistic healing, evidence-based intuition. The terminology doesn't matter. What matters is that we stop pretending miracles are accidents and start acknowledging the partnership that's been there all along. Isabella stirred in Elena's arms, making the soft mewing sounds of a newborn testing her voice, and Elena felt the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her through the storm. But now it extended beyond her daughter to encompass every patient who might benefit from physicians brave enough to practice with their whole selves. Start small, Patricia suggested, but Elena could see the spark of possibility igniting in her friend's eyes. The monthly case review meetings. When we discuss the inexplicable recoveries, what if we began documenting the intuitive decisions alongside the medical interventions? Elena felt her pulse quicken with something that transcended medical excitement. This was the same certainty that had guided her hands through Isabella's delivery, the knowing that arose from sources deeper than individual intelligence. Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chen's supplemental treatment protocols, she said, testing how the words felt. Evidence-based intuitive medicine. The administration would never approve formal protocols, Patricia warned, but informal mentorship, teaching residents to recognize and trust their clinical intuition alongside their textbook knowledge. Teaching them that healing happens through partnership, Elena agreed, feeling the plan crystallize with inevitable clarity, that their hands can be instruments of grace they don't have to understand to access. Patricia stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the storm-cleared sky. You're asking me to risk everything I've built, 15 years of establishing credibility, of proving that female physicians can be just as clinically rigorous as our male colleagues. Elena adjusted Isabella's position, marveling at how naturally her body knew what to do now that fear had stepped aside. I'm asking you to risk everything we've built on foundations that were only half complete. Patricia, how many patients have we lost because we were too afraid to trust the insights that might have saved them? How many times have we dismissed our own knowing because it couldn't be measured in a lab? The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of careers that could be transformed or destroyed by the choice ahead. Elena felt the stranger's presence like a warm current at the edge of her awareness, not visible but unmistakably there, supporting her as she prepared to step fully into the role he'd revealed. Patricia turned from the window, her expression resolving into the same determination Elena had seen her bring to impossible cases. The teenage overdose last month. Jamie Rodriguez. I changed his entire detox protocol because something told me the standard treatment would kill him. Saved his life, but I documented it as clinical judgment based on patient presentation. What if you documented it as partnership between clinical knowledge and intuitive assessment? Elena asked. What if we started acknowledging that our best medicine happens when we combine everything we've learned with everything we sense? The other physicians would think we'd lost our minds, Patricia said, but she was smiling now, which might be exactly what we need to lose. Elena felt Isabella's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of infant sleep, and suddenly the magnitude of what they were contemplating became crystalline. Not just changing their own practice, but pioneering a model that could transform how medicine was taught and practiced. Physicians learning to trust themselves as instruments of healing that operated through partnership rather than isolation. The final test, Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her like sunrise. This is what the stranger meant. The birth was just the beginning. The real challenge is returning to practice and integrating everything I learned. Patricia moved closer, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone they'd used as residents sharing impossible dreams. We start with documentation. Every case where intuition guides decision-making, every inexplicable recovery, every moment when our hands seem to know more than our training taught them. We build evidence that something beyond pure medical science is operating in healing. Elena felt the same certainty that had carried her through Isabella's delivery, the knowing that arose when individual will aligned with forces larger than personal capability. And we teach it, not as mysticism but as completion, helping the next generation of physicians practice with their whole selves instead of just their analytical minds. Isabella's tiny fist uncurled against Elena's chest, fingers spreading like a star claiming its place in the vast constellation of possibility. Elena looked down at her daughter and felt the future reshaping itself around this moment of choice. Everything that happened next would flow from the decision to trust the partnership that had always been there, waiting for physicians brave enough to acknowledge it. "Are you ready to change medicine?" Elena asked. Patricia's smile carried all the determination of a woman who'd never backed down from impossible cases. "I've been ready since medical school. I just didn't know what I was waiting for." The final test had begun. The hospital board meeting 3 days later felt like walking into an execution chamber. Elena had barely been discharged, but she'd insisted on attending, Isabella sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside the conference table. Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of staff, had called the emergency session after Patricia submitted their preliminary proposal for integrative clinical assessment protocols. "Dr. Martinez," Webb began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "I understand you've had a traumatic experience. Perhaps you should take more time before returning to departmental decisions." Elena felt the familiar weight of dismissal, the subtle invalidation she'd faced throughout her medical career whenever she'd challenged established protocols. But this time, something had fundamentally shifted. The stranger's presence hummed at the edge of her awareness, not visible, but unmistakably supportive, reminding her that she no longer practiced alone. "My experience was transformative, not traumatic," Elena said, meeting Webb's gaze steadily. And it revealed gaps in our current treatment philosophy that we can't continue ignoring. Dr. Richard Stenbridge, head of emergency medicine, leaned forward aggressively. Elena, you delivered a baby alone in a forest. The stress, the blood loss, possible postpartum psychosis. These are medical facts. What you think you experienced isn't reliable data. The words hit like physical blows, designed to shatter her confidence and reduce her revelation to pathology. Elena felt Isabella shift in her carrier, and the movement steadied her, reminding her of the perfect delivery that had emerged from partnership rather than pure medical intervention. Richard, explain the Henderson cardiac case from last spring, Elena said quietly. 23 minutes without a heartbeat. By every medical standard, he was dead. But Patricia refused to stop, worked beyond protocol, and brought him back. Complete neurological recovery. How do you document that as reliable data? Clinical judgment, Stenbridge began. Based on what? Patricia interrupted, her voice sharp with years of accumulated frustration. His vitals said he was dead. The monitors said he was dead. Every textbook said he was dead. But something told me to keep working, and that something saved his life. Webb's expression hardened into the institutional resistance Elena had expected. Dr. Chen, you're describing intuition, not medicine. We practice evidence-based healthcare, not mystical healing. Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of every patient she'd lost to protocols that prioritized institutional liability over clinical possibility. Dr. Webb, how many patients have we failed because we trusted machines over instinct? How many recoveries have we dismissed as spontaneous instead of acknowledging the partnership between knowledge and wisdom? Partnership with what? Stenbridge demanded. You're talking about supernatural intervention in medical practice. The legal implications alone. I'm talking about completing our medical education, Elena shot back, her voice gaining strength. We learned anatomy, pharmacology, surgical techniques, but nobody taught us to recognize when healing requires more than technical intervention. Nobody taught us that our hands can be instruments of grace we don't have to understand to access. The room erupted into voices, some supportive, others dismissive, all carrying the tension of a profession being asked to evolve beyond comfortable limitations. Elena felt the familiar pattern of institutional suppression beginning, the systematic dismantling of ideas that threatened established power structures. But then, Isabella began to cry, not the distressed wailing of discomfort, but the clear, demanding voice of a child claiming her space in the world. The sound cut through the arguing voices like a bell, and suddenly Elena understood the true nature of the confrontation she was facing. This wasn't about convincing colleagues or changing hospital policy. This was about whether she would allow institutional fear to silence the truth that had saved her daughter's life. I'm resigning from Cape Fear Valley, Elena announced, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Patricia and I are opening an independent practice where physicians can integrate intuitive assessment with medical knowledge without fear of institutional retaliation. The silence that followed was deafening. Webb's face cycled through shock, anger, and calculation. Elena, you're throwing away a distinguished career over post-traumatic delusions. Think about what you're doing. Elena lifted Isabella from her carrier, feeling her daughter's warm weight against her chest, like an anchor to everything that mattered. I'm thinking about Jamie Rodriguez, who lived because Patricia trusted her instincts over standard protocols. I'm thinking about Maria Santos, who might have survived if I'd been brave enough to practice medicine with my whole self, instead of just my analytical mind. She looked around the conference table, meeting each colleague's eyes in turn. I'm thinking about every patient who deserves physicians courageous enough to acknowledge that healing happens through partnership, our knowledge working with forces larger than hospital liability policies. Patricia stood beside her, decision crystallizing into action. My resignation will be on your desk this afternoon. As they walked toward the door, Elena felt the stranger's presence like warm wind at her back, carrying her toward a future where medicine could finally become what it was meant to be. Not just treatment, but true healing through conscious partnership with the wisdom that had always been waiting for physicians brave enough to trust it. The confrontation was over. The real work was about to begin. The elevator doors closed behind them with mechanical finality, sealing Elena and Patricia into a silence that hummed with the magnitude of what they'd just done. Elena felt Isabella's heartbeat against her chest, steady, trusting, completely unaware that her mother had just sacrificed everything she'd spent 15 years building. "My pension," Patricia whispered, staring at the descending floor numbers. "My research funding, the cardiology fellowship I was supposed to start next month." Her voice cracked. "Elena, do you realize what we just gave up?" Elena's throat tightened as the full weight of their decision crystallized. The prestigious position at Cape Fear Valley, the security of institutional medicine, the respect of colleagues who would now dismiss her as unstable, gone. Everything she'd fought for as a woman in emergency medicine, every barrier she'd broken, every late night spent proving herself worthy of the boys' club. "My department head position," Elena said quietly. "The trauma research grant I'd been working on for 3 years. The recommendation letters I'd written for residents who looked up to me." She paused, feeling the stranger's presence shimmer at the edge of her awareness. The safety of practicing medicine where mistakes are covered by institutional insurance instead of personal liability. The elevator opened into the parking garage, and they walked toward Patricia's car in the fluorescent-lit silence. Elena felt each step carrying her further from the professional identity she'd spent her adult life constructing. Dr. Elena Martinez, respected emergency physician. Dr. Elena Martinez, department head and mentor. Dr. Elena Martinez, published researcher. All of it dissolving into uncertainty. "We don't have funding," Patricia said as she unlocked her car. "No building, no equipment, no established patient base. Elena, we just announced we're starting an independent practice with approaches that sound insane to 90% of the medical community." Elena secured Isabella's carrier in the back seat, her hands trembling slightly as reality crashed over her in waves. "We don't even have malpractice insurance for integrative protocols. What if we're wrong? What if the stranger was some kind of postpartum hallucination and we just destroyed our careers chasing delusions?" Patricia gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. "My mother worked 3 jobs to put me through medical school. She died 2 months before I graduated, believing she'd sacrificed everything so her daughter could have security. And I just walked away from that security based on—" She turned to Elena, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Based on what? Faith that mysterious forces will support us practicing medicine through supernatural partnership?" The words hung between them like a diagnosis neither wanted to accept. Elena felt Isabella shift in her carrier, making the soft sounds that preceded crying, and suddenly the full scope of her sacrifice hit her like physical pain. She'd just bet her daughter's future on the belief that healing could transcend institutional medicine. "Isabella's college fund was tied to my hospital pension," Elena whispered. "Her healthcare coverage, her security. I just gambled everything she'll ever need on the possibility that we can build something completely unprecedented." Patricia started the engine, but made no move to drive. "We're not just risking our careers, we're risking our ability to help anyone. If this fails, if we can't establish credible practice, every patient who might have benefited from our hospital work will suffer. Every resident we might have mentored, every protocol we might have improved from within the system." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the stranger's presence pulse gently at her consciousness, not visible but unmistakably there, carrying the same certainty that had guided Isabella's delivery. But certainty didn't pay malpractice premiums or provide the technological resources that saved lives in emergency medicine. "The Henderson case," Elena said suddenly. "When you brought him back after 23 minutes, what would have happened if you'd been practicing independently? No crash team, no advanced life support equipment, no backup physicians." He would have died, Patricia admitted. The partnership you're talking about, it worked within institutional medicine. We had resources, support systems, technology that amplified our intuitive decisions. Now we're choosing to practice without any of those safety nets. Elena felt tears building as she looked at Isabella, sleeping peacefully despite having just inherited a future built on her mother's leap of faith rather than careful planning. The stranger had shown her what was possible when medical knowledge partnered with forces beyond understanding, but he'd never warned her that victory would require sacrificing everything familiar. "We can't go back," Elena said quietly, feeling the truth settle into her bones like winter cold. "Even if we wanted to reconsider, Webb will make sure word spreads. We'll be the physicians who tried to integrate supernatural healing into hospital practice." Career poison. Patricia finally put the car in drive, pulling out of the parking garage toward an uncertain future. "Then we better be right about this partnership, because we just bet everything on forces we can't see, understand, or control." As they drove away from Cape Fear Valley, Elena felt the hospital disappearing behind them like a door closing on the physician she'd been. The real cost of victory wasn't just what they'd given up. It was the terrifying responsibility of proving that healing through conscious partnership could justify sacrificing everything safe and known. The stranger's presence hummed around them, patient and eternal, carrying them toward a future that would demand everything they'd learned to trust, everything they couldn't explain. The silence in Patricia's car stretched for miles, broken only by Isabella's occasional sighs and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. Elena watched familiar landmarks blur past: the coffee shop where she'd celebrated her first published research, the intersection where she received the call about her department head promotion, the billboard advertising Cape Fear Valley's award-winning emergency services. Each mile carried her further from the life she'd spent 15 years building. "Where are we going?" she asked suddenly, realizing Patricia had been driving without apparent destination. "I don't know," Patricia admitted, her voice hollow. "My apartment has medical journals scattered everywhere, reminders of the research I just abandoned. Your house is full of Isabella's nursery, decorated with savings from the job you just quit." She pulled into a roadside diner's parking lot, engine idling. "I honestly don't know where people go when they've just blown up their entire existence." Elena unbuckled Isabella's carrier, lifting her daughter against her chest. The baby's warmth felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid, uncertain. "The Henderson case?" she said quietly. "Tell me again what you felt when you decided to keep working." Patricia's hands remained clenched on the steering wheel, like my hands knew something my brain didn't, like the monitors were lying and my palms were telling the truth. She turned to Elena, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "But Elena, what if that was just adrenaline? What if we just destroyed our careers chasing chemical reactions we interpreted as mystical guidance?" Elena felt the familiar spiral of doubt beginning, the rational physician's mind cataloguing every possible explanation that didn't require acknowledging forces beyond medical training. But then Isabella's tiny fist pressed against her collarbone, and she remembered the moment of perfect clarity during the delivery, when her hands had moved with knowledge she'd never learned. "The stranger knew my name," Elena said. "He knew about the bleeding before I told him. He guided me through procedures I'd never performed, and Isabella lived." She looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "I can document the medical impossibilities, Patricia, but I can't explain them away." Patricia finally turned off the engine. Through the diner's windows, Elena could see ordinary people eating ordinary meals, living lives uncomplicated by supernatural encounters or career-destroying leaps of faith. Part of her ached for that simplicity, the comfort of problems solvable through established protocols. "My mother always said medicine was a calling, not just a career," Patricia said slowly. "But I thought she meant the calling to help people within accepted frameworks. I never imagined it might mean burning down everything conventional to practice healing we couldn't defend in peer review." Elena felt the stranger's presence shimmer at the edge of her awareness, not visible but carrying the same patient certainty that had sustained her through Isabella's birth. What if that's exactly what medicine needs? Physicians willing to acknowledge that our best outcomes happen when we trust partnership between knowledge and wisdom we can't quantify. And what if we're wrong? Patricia's voice cracked. What if we just threw away the ability to help people because we confused stress-induced hallucinations with divine intervention? The question hung between them like a diagnosis neither wanted to face. Elena closed her eyes, feeling Isabella's breath against her neck, remembering the moment when she'd stopped trying to control the delivery and started allowing forces beyond her understanding to guide her hands. "The teenage overdose you saved," Elena said. "Jamie Rodriguez. You changed his entire treatment protocol because something told you the standard approach would kill him. That wasn't stress or adrenaline. That was partnership." Patricia's expression began to shift, doubt warring with recognition. The protocol said, increase the medication. Every textbook, every clinical guideline. But my hands started shaking when I reached for the syringe, like my body was refusing to follow my training. "So you trusted your body over your textbook and saved his life." Elena felt certainty building like sunrise. "We're not abandoning medicine, Patricia. We're completing it." Isabella stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds that meant hunger was approaching. Such an ordinary need, feeding, comfort, the simple requirements that kept life moving forward. Elena realized that's what they were doing, taking the next necessary step, even when they couldn't see the path ahead. "We document everything," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "Every case where intuitive guidance leads to positive outcomes, every moment when partnership between clinical knowledge and unexplainable wisdom saves lives. We build evidence that something beyond pure medical science operates in healing." Patricia's smile started small, but Elena recognized the spark behind it. The same determination that had driven them through residency, through impossible cases, through every challenge that had demanded more than textbook solutions. "We're really doing this," Patricia whispered, "starting over with no safety net except faith in forces we can't prove exist." Elena looked down at Isabella, seeing in her daughter's face the future they were choosing to create. Medicine practiced through conscious partnership, healing that honored both knowledge and mystery. "The stranger said this was the final test," Elena said, "not the birth. This moment when we choose trust over security." Patricia started the engine again, but this time her hands were steady on the wheel. "Then let's pass it." The diner's fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief as they sat across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth. Elena had Isabella's carrier beside her, one hand resting protectively on the handle while she stirred coffee that had grown cold. Patricia pushed eggs around her plate, neither of them really eating, both processing the magnitude of what they'd set in motion. "I keep thinking about Dr. Morrison," Patricia said suddenly. "Remember him? The attending who taught us that medicine was equal parts science and art? He'd probably understand what we're trying to do." Elena smiled, remembering the gruff cardiologist who'd mentored them during their darkest residency nights. He died 3 years ago. Massive stroke, ironically. But he always said the best physicians were the ones who knew when to trust their instincts over their instruments. "Maybe that's what we're really doing," Patricia mused. "Not abandoning evidence-based medicine, but expanding what we accept as evidence." Through the diner window, Elena watched an ambulance speed past toward Cape Fear Valley, lights flashing, carrying someone's emergency toward the colleagues they'd just left behind. Part of her felt the familiar pull, the adrenaline rush of trauma medicine, the satisfaction of protocols executed flawlessly under pressure. But a larger part recognized that she could never practice that way again, not after experiencing healing as conscious partnership rather than clinical intervention. "I dreamed about the stranger last night," Elena admitted. "He was standing in a hospital room, but it wasn't like any hospital I'd seen. The equipment was familiar, but the atmosphere was different, peaceful, like the technology was serving something larger instead of driving everything." Patricia leaned forward, interest sparking in her exhausted eyes. What was he doing? Teaching. There were physicians learning to use their hands the way we learned during the Henderson case, during Isabella's delivery. They were practicing medicine that integrated everything: clinical knowledge, intuitive assessment, partnership with forces that enhanced healing rather than fighting them. Isabella began to fuss, and Elena lifted her from the carrier, feeling her daughter's weight settle against her chest like an anchor to the future they were choosing. It wasn't some alternative medicine fantasy, Patricia. It was medicine evolved, physicians using every tool available, stethoscopes and surgical skills, but also the wisdom that comes through hands that have learned to listen. A teaching hospital for integrated practice, Patricia said slowly, her voice carrying the first real excitement Elena had heard since they'd left Cape Fear Valley. Not rejecting conventional medicine, but expanding it. Elena felt Isabella's tiny fist grasp her finger, such a simple gesture carrying profound trust. What if that's what we're really building? Not just an independent practice, but proof that medicine can evolve beyond the limitations institutions impose on healing. Patricia pulled out her phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before setting it aside. 17 missed calls from Webb, 12 from Dr. Stenbridge. The medical community is already buzzing about our resignation. Good or bad buzzing? Both, probably. But Elena? Patricia's expression shifted, recognition dawning. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Integrative Oncology program at Duke called. She wants to meet with us. Says there are physicians throughout the state who've been waiting for someone to articulate what we said in that conference room. Elena felt the stranger's presence pulse gently at her consciousness, carrying approval like warm wind. The confrontation at Cape Fear Valley hadn't been an ending. It had been a declaration, a signal flare for physicians ready to practice medicine as conscious partnership. We're not alone in this, Elena realized. There are others who've experienced what we experienced, who've been practicing intuitive medicine within institutional constraints, waiting for permission to acknowledge what they know is possible. Patricia's smile was tentative but growing stronger. Dr. Chen mentioned funding opportunities through foundations focused on consciousness research, federal grants for innovative healthcare delivery models. Maybe we don't have to build this entirely through faith. Isabella had settled into peaceful sleep again, her breathing steady against Elena's chest. Looking down at her daughter's face, Elena saw not the burden of an uncertain future, but the promise of medicine practiced without artificial limitations, healing that honored both scientific rigor and the mystery that had saved Isabella's life. The stranger said something I keep remembering, Elena said. That healing happens when we stop trying to control outcomes and start trusting partnership. Maybe that applies to building this practice too. Patricia nodded, pulling out her laptop. Let's start documenting. Every case where intuitive guidance led to positive outcomes, every moment when partnership saved lives. We build the evidence base that proves what we know is true. As Elena watched Patricia begin typing, she felt the first real peace she'd experienced since walking out of Cape Fear Valley. They weren't just two physicians who'd sacrificed their careers for mystical delusions. They were pioneers in medicine's evolution, building bridges between knowledge and wisdom that could transform how healing happened. The return to their world wouldn't be a retreat to familiar safety. It would be the creation of something unprecedented, medicine practiced through conscious partnership, healing that honored every tool available to physicians brave enough to trust forces larger than hospital protocols. The stranger's presence hummed around them, patient and eternal, carrying them toward the work that had always been waiting. The new beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood in the converted farmhouse that had become the Carolina Center for Integrative Medicine, watching Patricia demonstrate guided palpation techniques to a group of residents from 3 different teaching hospitals. The morning sunlight streamed through windows they'd enlarged specifically to bring natural light into treatment spaces, and the sound of Isabella's contented babbling drifted from the nursery alcove where she played under the watchful eye of their nurse practitioner. Feel beyond the physical findings, Patricia was saying, her hands moving over a practice mannequin, while the residents observed intently. Let your clinical knowledge inform your touch, but allow your intuition to guide where you focus. The body will tell you what needs attention if you learn to listen. Elena smiled, remembering her own skepticism the first time she'd heard such instruction. Now, watching Dr. Chen's oncology resident nod with sudden understanding as his hands found an area of tension the mannequin's programming hadn't indicated, she saw the moment when medical training expanded beyond institutional limitations. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Another inquiry from a physician who'd heard about their outcomes. Their patient roster had grown beyond anything they'd imagined possible, not through advertising but through the quiet network of healthcare providers who whispered about the place where healing happened differently, where a pediatric surgeon had learned to trust her hands during complex procedures, where an emergency physician had developed assessment skills that caught critical diagnoses other doctors missed. "Dr. Martinez?" The voice belonged to James Henderson, the cardiac arrest patient whose impossible recovery had started Patricia's journey toward conscious partnership. He visited monthly now, not as a patient but as a volunteer, helping other survivors understand that healing could continue long after hospital discharge. "The support group is ready for you." Elena nodded, checking on Isabella one more time, before heading to the larger room where 8 patients sat in a circle. People who'd experienced medical crises that had brought them to the edge between life and death. Each had stories of moments when conventional treatment had reached its limits, when recovery had required partnership with forces beyond clinical intervention. "Today we're talking about trust," Elena began, settling into the circle with the natural ease that had developed over months of these gatherings. Not blind faith, but the conscious decision to work with healing forces we may not fully understand. Margaret Chen, a stroke survivor who'd regained speech function doctors had said was impossible, raised her hand tentatively. "I still don't know what happened during my recovery. My neurologist says the brain scans show healing that shouldn't exist. But I remember the moment when I stopped fighting the rehabilitation and started letting my body teach me." Elena felt the familiar warmth that came when someone articulated the mystery they'd all learned to embrace. That's partnership, clinical knowledge creating the framework, but wisdom beyond our training guiding the actual healing. The session continued with stories Elena never grew tired of hearing. Accounts of recovery that transcended medical predictions, moments when patients had learned to trust forces larger than their diagnoses. But today felt different, charged with an energy she recognized from the hurricane shelter where her journey had begun. After the group dispersed, Elena found Patricia in their shared office, reviewing research data that would become their first peer-reviewed publication. The evidence was undeniable now, patient outcomes that consistently exceeded statistical expectations, recovery rates that demanded explanation beyond conventional treatment protocols. "Duke wants to establish a fellowship program," Patricia announced without looking up from her computer. "Formal training in integrated medicine for physicians who want to develop intuitive assessment skills alongside clinical expertise." Elena settled into her chair, Isabella gurgling contentedly in her lap. Through the window, she could see their latest addition to the center, a meditation garden where patients often experienced breakthrough moments in their healing journeys. Fellowship training means institutional validation, academic recognition. "It means medicine is evolving," Patricia corrected, finally meeting Elena's eyes. "What we thought would remain forever outside established healthcare is becoming part of the conversation." Elena felt a familiar presence shimmer at the edge of awareness, not visible but unmistakably there, carrying the same patient certainty that had guided Isabella's delivery and sustained their leap of faith. The stranger's presence had become less dramatic over the months, woven into the daily fabric of their practice rather than appearing in moments of crisis. "He's proud," Elena said quietly, knowing Patricia would understand. "We passed the test." Isabella made a sound that might have been agreement, reaching tiny fingers toward the late afternoon light that painted everything golden. In her daughter's eyes, Elena saw the future they'd chosen to create, medicine practiced without artificial boundaries, healing that honored both rigorous training and mysterious wisdom. The phone rang again. another physician ready to learn what they'd discovered. Patricia answered with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned to trust partnership over protocols, and Elena heard her begin the conversation that would bring another healer into their expanding circle. Outside, the meditation garden was peaceful in the fading light, waiting for tomorrow's patients who would discover that healing could transcend everything they'd thought possible. The work continued, carried by forces patient and eternal, growing into the medicine that had always been waiting.